What kind of mind turns hunger into a weapon? Genghis Khan, known as the Great Khan of the Mongols, perfected siege starvation into a terrifying instrument of conquest. His armies didn't just storm cities. They encircled them, sealed every exit, and waited, not days, but weeks, sometimes months. Inside, bread crumbled to dust, rats disappeared, and the dead were quietly eaten. 32. In 1219, when Genghis Khan invaded the Khwarezmian Empire, he laid siege to the great city of Nishapur. Unable to quickly breach its walls, the Mongols cut the city off entirely. They halted all food supplies, poisoned nearby wells, and set up a complete perimeter so no one could come or go. 34. This was deliberate, not desperate. Mongol engineers calculated how long provisions would last inside. Once the starvation threshold passed, desperation broke defenders. Some cities surrendered before a sword was drawn. Others resisted, only to descend into horrors far worse. Persian chronicler Ata Malik Juvaini recorded that besieged inhabitants were driven to eat leather, grass, and, in the most extreme cases, the corpses of the dead. None remained to bury the corpses, he wrote of Merv, and the dogs feasted on the flesh of the faithful. When the gates finally fell, the Mongols showed no mercy. Survivors, gaunt, skeletal, almost no longer human, were slaughtered or enslaved. The siege starvation tactic was more than a path to victory. It was psychological warfare, a message that resistance meant not merely death, but a slow, humiliating, helpless end. The human shield line, sacrificed before battle. Among the countless horrors unleashed by Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire in 1206, one tactic remains among the most chilling: the deliberate use of human shields. This was no accident of war. It was a calculated policy, cold, methodical, and devastatingly effective. After each conquest, the Mongols gathered prisoners, men, women, children, even the elderly. They were not executed, not yet. Instead, they were driven to the front lines of the next battle, unarmed, terrified, disposable. Their purpose was as cruel as it was strategic: to absorb the first storm of arrows, to exhaust the enemy's firepower, to turn compassion into chaos. One of the darkest examples came during the Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire in 1281. At the siege of Gurganj, a city famed for its wealth and defiance. As the defenders rained arrows from the walls, Genghis Khan gave an order that silenced even his own generals. Thousands of captives, taken from nearby towns that had already fallen, were forced forward toward the gates. Their screams merged with the thunder of hooves and the hiss of incoming fire. Persian historian Ata Malik Juvaini, writing in his chronicle Tarikh-i-Jahangushe, The History of the World Conqueror, recorded this with chilling precision. They used the people of one city to batter down the next. Hittites, single line that captures the Mongol, genius for turning cruelty into weaponry. The living became instruments of siege, their bodies both shield and sacrifice. Captives were tied together in chains or ropes, forming lines that stretched across the battlefield. Some were placed before siege towers and catapults, shielding them from enemy fire. Others were forced to dig trenches, fill moats, or drag stones under the relentless rain of arrows. Many died before reaching the walls. Those who survived were often executed after victory. Their usefulness ended with the fall of the city. But this tactic went beyond military logic. It was psychological warfare on an unimaginable scale. Imagine being a defender upon those walls, looking down to see your own countrymen, your neighbors, your family, driven forward at spear point, their bodies turned into the first wave of an army that could not be stopped. The Mongols didn't just crush cities, They crushed the will to resist. Each act of horror carried a message: surrender, or your people will die in your place. The defenders of Gurganj understood that message too late. Their arrows struck not Mongol soldiers, but the helpless, and with every death, their own resolve began to fracture. By the time the Mongols breached the walls, the city's spirit had already been conquered. To the Mongols, there was no such thing as mercy in war. War was not a contest of valor, it was a science of fear. And if victory required the blood of innocents, then that blood became the mortar that built their empire. Genghis Khan believed that compassion weakened command. The greater the terror he inspired, the fewer battles he would need to fight. So he turned survival itself into a weapon, forcing one population to march against another, forcing one city's tears to drown the next. The tactic worked. Entire regions surrendered without resistance. Their rulers, too, haunted by the stories that traveled faster than the Mongols themselves. The line of human shields, those nameless, broken captives, became an invisible army of fear. Their suffering was never recorded in victory songs, but it was their sacrifice that paved the road to conquest. And so, when we speak of the Mongols' brilliance in battle, their discipline, their speed, their tactics, we must also remember this, that behind every triumph of strategy lay a shadow built from human lives. A line of innocents marched to die, not for loyalty, not for honor, but for the empire that saw them as nothing more than armor made of flesh. For Genghis Khan, war was total, not soldier against soldier, but humanity itself turned inward against its own. The Mongol Empire did not simply conquer the world. It weaponized it, one body, one city, one shield at a time. Death by tramplings. Verdict of the steppe. In the year 1223, on the wind-swept plains near the Kalka River, the Mongols crushed a coalition of Rus's princes and their Kipchak allies. For those who survived the battle, mercy did not follow. What awaited them was not justice, but humiliation, crafted with precision. Under the command of Genghis Khan, his generals Subutai and Jebe had no interest in treating their captives as noble warriors. They wanted something greater than victory. They wanted submission written in memory, and so they turned execution into theater. A grim performance to remind all who watched what defiance would cost. Among the captured were Mstislav of Kiev and several other Rus's nobles, princes who had once commanded armies, now reduced to trembling prisoners. But their deaths would not come by sword or fire. According to both Rus's chronicles and Persian historians, the Mongols forced these men face down upon the earth, their faces pressed into the soil they had once ruled. Then, above their living bodies, the Mongols built a great wooden platform. When it was finished, they began a feast. Tables were set, wine was poured, and laughter filled the air. While above, the victors celebrated. Below, the princes suffocated beneath the crushing weight of Mongol dominance. Each passing moment, each cup raised in mockery, pressed the life out of the captives. Their bones cracked beneath the boards, their last sounds swallowed by the cheers above. Accounts differ in small detail, but all agree on the same horror. The Mongols had chosen this method with care. To them, noble blood was sacred. It was forbidden to spill it upon the ground. So they found another way, a death that was brutal, but technically bloodless. It was cruelty wrapped in ritual, a slaughter disguised as ceremony. As the feast dragged on, the weight of the platform and of those seated upon it crushed the last breath from the men below. When the final toast was raised, the princes were already dead, their bodies flattened, their dignity erased. But this was never about revenge. It was about message. The Mongols understood that fear travels farther than any army. This was psychological. Warfare in its purest form, a demonstration of absolute power. to dine upon the bodies of your enemies. To turn their death into a celebration was to declare yourself not merely conqueror, but godlike. For the steppe had its own laws, its own verdicts, and in that law, defeat demanded more than death. It demanded obliteration of pride, of name, of worth. The Mongols didn't just kill their enemies, they consumed them, body and legend alike. So when the chronicles speak of the verdict of the steppe, they speak not only of death, but of a message carved deep into history. Dragged behind horses, the punishment reserved for traitors. Dragged behind horses, the punishment reserved for traitors. Among all the punishments carried out under the rule of Genghis Khan, one stood apart for its brutal symbolism. A punishment not of passion, but of principle, reserved for one crime above all others: betrayal. Those found guilty of treason, defectors, spies, or governors who had once surrendered yet dared to resist again, were bound to the rear of a horse and dragged until death. It was not a battlefield sentence born of chaos. It was deliberate, a public declaration that disloyalty had only one end: to be erased by the dust. Under Mongol law, treason was not simply disobedience. It was a tear in the fabric of the Khan's world, an offense that threatened not just power, but order itself. And in the eyes of Genghis Khan, that demanded punishment, swift, merciless, and absolute. The process was simple. The condemned's hands were bound tightly behind their back. Sometimes, their shoulders were wrenched from their sockets to prevent any attempt at struggle. Ropes were tied to a horse's saddle, and at a soldier's command, the beast was spurred into motion. The victim was dragged across open ground, stones tearing skin, dust filling the lungs. Sometimes the ordeal lasted only minutes. Other times, it went on for miles, until body and soul were beyond recognition. Historical accounts place this punishment across Central Asia and the Middle East during the Mongol campaigns. When a governor broke allegiance, when a city rebelled after submission, when spies whispered to rival empires, this was their end. The Mongols did not hide their justice. They made it public. They wanted witnesses, citizens, soldiers, slaves, all to see the body dragged lifeless through the dirt. And when it ended, the remains were often left at the city gates, a silent warning to all who might follow. Behind the horror was logic. The punishment was not chaos, it was law. Genghis Khan's Yasa, his great code, demanded absolute loyalty to the Khan and to the empire. Any who endangered that unity were not seen as enemies. They were seen as disease. And disease, in Mongol eyes, could not be cured. It had to be destroyed. There was no need for spectacle. No speeches, no flames, no drama. This execution was fast, final, and impossible to forget. The sound of hooves, the dust rising in the air, and silence where once a traitor had stood. The Mongol Empire did not simply conquer lands. It redesigned fear. It turned punishment into propaganda, justice into legend. Each execution became a lesson, carved into human flesh, carried by rumor across deserts and mountains. They understood something few empires ever did. Terror, when disciplined, is the most efficient form of rule, and in that fear, their empire found stability. These were not excesses, they were strategies. Every punishment had a purpose, every death a message. To betray the Khan was to betray the order of the world, and the world would grind you back into dust. Comment below, how did the Mongols' brutal use of punishment shape their rise, from wandering tribes to the rulers of the largest land empire in history? As the chronicler Atamalik Juvaini wrote, "They came, they sapped, they burned, they slew, they plundered, and they departed.